There was a time when all you had to do was turn on the radio on a weekend night, and their voices would drift out soft but unshakable. The Dells. 5 black men whose harmonies floated through a bruised America like a love letter no one had the courage to write out loud. What came from those speakers wasn't just music. It was memory. Memories of an era when love was carved into melodies and pain was tucked into every breath that lingered at the end of a note. From a forgotten underpass in Harvey, Illinois, to the vaulted ceiling of Carnegie Hall, these 5 voices became a bridge carrying them over prejudice and into the hearts of strangers they would never meet. Songs like "Oh, What a Night" and "Stay in My Corner" weren't simply hits. They were timestamps, the very breath of a moment in American life that would never repeat itself. People used to say the Dells were the group that never broke up. The legend went that they outlasted every storm the music business could throw at them. But it was precisely because they stayed together that long that they had to stand there and watch one by one as each man fell. Some collapsed only after the stage lights dimmed. Some slipped away in absolute silence, no headlines, no features, not even a small column in the back of a newspaper. None of them died rich. None left behind mansions, luxury cars, or secure bank accounts. They gave their entire lives to music and left with bodies worn down by illness and pockets thinned by bad contracts. Somewhere in old rooms no one visits anymore, there are still secrets about what they endured that have never been fully told. So what actually happened? How did a group that sounded immortal end up with such a painfully fragile ending? To understand the tragedy, you have to go back to the years before the spotlights, before their name echoed through elegant auditoriums. It started in a place no one would have chosen as the birthplace of a legend. A dusty corner of a schoolyard where dreams barely had time to rise before someone tried to shut them down. In the spring of 1952, Harvey was still wrapped in the dull gray of industry. Every morning, trains cut across the main road, and the steel mill whistle announced another day that looked exactly like the one before. Change didn't come to this town. It just circled overhead and kept moving. Yet in the yard of Thornton Township High School, 5 black boys quietly carved out a small refuge for themselves. They didn't find each other through school clubs or organized activities. They gravitated toward one another because each lunch break, like clockwork, they ended up near the same backyard fence, humming the choruses of songs by the Moonglows or the 5 Keys. Marvin Jr. carried a baritone so thick and deep it felt like summer thunder rolling over hot pavement. Mickey McGill, the quietest of the group, rarely spoke, but when he slid into those low harmonies, no one dared interrupt. Vern Allison and Johnny Funches were the ones always trying to outclimb each other, pushing for the higher notes just to see who would crack first. And Chuck Barksdale, with his resonant bass, loved to end their sidewalk sessions with some joke that left all of them bent over laughing. They didn't think of themselves as a band. There was no contract, no big vision board, no master plan. It was simply something solid to hold onto a pocket of light tucked into school days that were heavy with exhaustion and quiet racism. They had no rehearsal space, no microphones, and certainly no money for equipment. What they did have was a small shed behind Mickey's house, where his mother stored broken chairs, dusty boxes, and one precious object, an old record player they could borrow if they were careful. Most afternoons, while other boys chased footballs or flirted with girls, these 5 kids squeezed themselves into that dank shed. They would put a record on listen in total silence, lift the needle back, and then rehearse each phrase, each harmony, each carefully controlled breath. But their favorite stage wasn't any room at all. It was the rough patch of concrete under the bridge on 147th Street. Whenever they sang there, the sound bounced off the low ceiling and came back at them as if an invisible choir had suddenly joined in. They always stood together in the center, never drifting too close to the sides, because everyone knew the risk. If they strayed to the wrong spot, a homeless person might relieve himself right through the cracks above. It sounded like a joke and they laughed about it, but it was also a hard metaphor for the world they lived in. You either sang loud and clear in the one safe place you were given, or life washed over you like dirty water. Eventually, they decided to test just how far their little circle of sound could travel. They wrote a letter asking for an audition at Chess Records, a label known for taking chances on new unproven acts. No one truly believed a reply would come. But one afternoon in June, a message arrived. They were invited in to record a short song called Christine. Marvin was chosen as the lead. Inside that cramped studio with the tape rolling and nerves rattling, he sang like a boy whose entire future was balanced on a single note. When the recording ended, the group looked around at each other, chests heaving, eyes wide, feeling for a second as though they might have actually touched something bigger than themselves. Then the moment shattered. One of the older producers in the room stood up, walked over to Marvin, and slowly looked him up and down. His voice when he spoke was flat, detached, the tone of a man reading out a statistic he'd already decided didn't matter. "You don't have a voice. You're not a singer. Thanks for trying." Silence hit the room like a dropped weight. Marvin didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply removed his headphones, placed them gently on the table, turned and walked straight out the door. None of the others managed to stop him. No one even found enough breath to ask if he was okay. Only the sound of his footsteps echoed down the hallway, each one pulling him farther away from what should have been his destiny. That was the first time the Dells, though they didn't yet carry that name, splintered. Not because of some great commercial failure, but because a single sentence had enough force to crush the fragile dream of a 17-year-old kid. After that day, the air between them was never quite the same. The dream was still there, but it no longer felt pure. It carried a bruise. Then 3 months later, on a fog-heavy evening in Harvey, Marvin came back. No one knew exactly where he had been. What they could see was that his face no longer belonged to the boy who had once cried from humiliation. His eyes had changed colder, deeper, like someone who had walked through a crack in the world and come back knowing things he didn't want to say out loud. Much later, Chuck would share a piece of the story Marvin never volunteered himself. After walking away from chess, Marvin had gone to a small recording studio on Chicago's South Side for one last audition as a solo singer. He arrived praying quietly that someone would finally hear what he heard inside his own chest. But the moment he stepped through the door, he froze. A stranger was already there, rehearsing Christine, the very song their group had first recorded, introducing himself to everyone as the writer. The origin of the song, the memory of that first session, the tiny bit of ownership they thought they had over their sound, it was being casually rewritten in front of his eyes. Marvin didn't explode. He didn't rush in to confront the man or demand an explanation. He simply stood behind a half-open door, watching, feeling the blood drain from his body until he could barely move. Then he left. That night he walked nearly 6 miles across Harvey. He didn't go home. He didn't sit down for dinner. He ended up back under the 147th Street Bridge, the place where their first harmonies had once bounced against the concrete like light. Alone in the freezing dark, he started to sing. No one heard him. But in that moment he understood something with terrifying clarity. If he didn't come back, if they didn't claim their sound and their name, their group wouldn't just disappear. It would be stolen, distorted, and buried as though it had never existed. The next morning, Marvin stood in front of the shed behind Mickey's house. He didn't deliver a speech. He just nodded. That was enough. When the 5 of them gathered again beneath the old bridge and raised their voices, there was a new tension in the air, a silent agreement. This time no one would be allowed to simply drift away. They decided it was time to leave the old identity behind. El Rey's sounded childish, easy to forget, like a scribble at the bottom of a talent show flyer. Each member scribbled a few new ideas on scraps of paper and tossed them into Chuck's wool hat. When they pulled out the slip that read Dells, everyone paused. The name felt plain, solid, and strangely inevitable. It matched the weight settling into their hearts. From early 1956 on, they called themselves the Dells. Then, almost as if the universe had been waiting for them to rename themselves, a small miracle arrived. On April 24, 1956, in a modest studio on South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, they recorded "Oh, What a Night." When Marvin laid down the opening lines, something changed in the room. Technicians stopped fidgeting with cables. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. By the time the song was finished, the air felt different charged. Within weeks of its release, the track began to crawl across radio playlists, then sprint. The melody was sweet and deceptively light, the lyrics floating like a breeze, while Marvin's deep, warm lead slid straight into listeners' chests. All over the country, people caught themselves humming the chorus, "Oh, what a night." Soon after, an invitation came that none of them dared dream about before. The Dells were called to perform at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, a stage known as the true proving ground for black artists. The Apollo didn't hand out mercy. That first night was notorious. If you didn't deliver, the crowd could turn on you without hesitation. It was what everyone half-joking called dying on your first night. On May 12, 1956, the Apollo was packed, well over 1,000 people, faces stacked from the orchestra pit to the highest balcony. Backstage, the group stood in a thin corridor, palms slick, hearts pounding like they were back at their first schoolyard sing-along. When the music cue finally came and Marvin stepped out into the light, the room went still. The first verses rolled out and the crowd listened, testing them. But when they reached the chorus, someone let out a whistle. Then another person shouted. When Marvin held that final note so long it seemed he might pass out before it broke, the entire room erupted. Thunderclap applause, a sea of people rising to their feet. The Dells had survived the Apollo. More than that, they had proved that a dream born under a concrete bridge could stand its ground on one of the toughest stages in America. From that night on, their lives turned a page. The doors that once stayed firmly shut began to crack open. But the glow didn't last long before something darker surged in. On the cold morning of November 21, 1958, as they drove back from a gig in Cleveland, the station wagon carrying the group sped down the Ohio Turnpike. One of the tires blew at high speed. The car spun, flipped onto its side, and scraped along the asphalt for what felt like forever. When it finally came to a stop, smoke curled from the hood, and the world went unsettlingly quiet. Mickey McGill was hurt the worst. His ribs and left leg were shattered, broken into pieces that would never fully knit back together. He was rushed to Toledo Memorial Hospital, where he would remain for 6 long months. The other members escaped the worst of the physical damage, but none of them walked away untouched. The crash lodged itself in their minds like shrapnel. As the shock settled, the Dells almost disintegrated. Marvin and Johnny Funches didn't go back to the stage. Instead, they took jobs at a local machine shop, trading spotlights for steel, sliding into lives that looked like those of thousands of other workers, early shifts, packed lunches, short naps grabbed under the pounding rhythm of metal presses. Music shrank into something distant, an echo everyone heard but pretended not to recognize. In his hospital bed, Mickey barely spoke. Nurses came and went. Days blurred. But every night he forced himself upright, trembling, and scribbled a few uneven lines with his good hand, sending letters to each of the other men. In one note, which Vern kept for the rest of his life, Mickey wrote, "I still hear us under that bridge when the pain medicine wears off. When everything hurts, those harmonies are the only thing that makes sense. Don't let them disappear." No one wrote back. Not because they didn't care, but because the silence between them had started to feel like a funeral already in progress. None of them knew how to answer without admitting they were afraid the dream had died on that highway. But the music refused to let go. Almost 3 years after the accident, when Mickey could finally stand again with the help of a steel brace, and Marvin found himself gasping for air every time he faced the relentless grind of the factory floor, a single question began to echo in all of their minds: if we're not singing, then who are we? In 1961, they chose to find out. They reunited, no fanfare, no expectations of fame, just 5 old friends, in a cheap rehearsal room on Chicago's South Side, testing each note as if they were learning how to breathe all over again. Then another unexpected doorway opened. Dinah Washington, the celebrated queen of the blues, known for her powerful voice and her unforgiving temper, was looking for a background group for a national tour. The Dells signed up for the audition. To this day, no one can say for sure why she picked them. Maybe it was the rawness still clinging to their sound. Maybe she saw something in Marvin's eyes that reminded her of what she herself had lost along the way. Either way, once she chose them, they were thrown straight into the fire. Dinah was not like anyone they had worked with before. Every night before a show, she would sit in her dressing room, a glass of wine in hand, listening through the thin walls, as the Dells rehearsed outside. One missed beat, one note even slightly off, and she'd be out the door in seconds. One evening, while they were running through What a Difference a Day Makes, Marvin missed his cue by half a beat. Dinah didn't yell. She simply hurled her wine glass at the wall. It shattered glass, skidding across the wooden floor. Then she turned to them, eyes like steel. "Start again," she said, "and this time, don't embarrass me." The hallway fell silent. People watched as though they were about to witness an execution. The Dells started over. This time there was not a single mistake. Later, Dinah offered only one line of praise. "Now you know what it means to sing like you're alive." 3 years on the road with her was like attending a brutal conservatory built on moving stages. They learned how to control their breath over roaring crowds, how to hold rhythm when the room was spinning, how to stand their ground through booze, blinding lights, and unpredictable sound systems. Dinah didn't just teach them. She tore them down and rebuilt them piece by piece until their voices were sharp enough to cut through any room. By the time the tour ended in 1964, hardly anyone recognized the scrappy kids who had once sung under a bridge. The Dells had turned into hardened musical soldiers, ready to keep going whether the path ahead led to another stage or a cliff. For a moment after leaving Dinah's tour, they believed the turbulence might finally settle. Then one day, Johnny Funches, the man whose voice had been there from the very beginning, showed up with a decision that knocked the wind out of everyone. "I have to stay home with my boy," he said quietly. "He's starting to ask why I'm never there." He didn't slam the door or rage against the grind. He left softly. But his departure felt like losing a foundation stone. The others stared at each other, unsure of how to move forward. Eventually they remembered Johnny Carter, a singer who had once performed with the Flamingos. When Carter sang at their first session together, the resemblance to Funches was eerie, his tone almost identical, but heavier, richer, as if he'd been storing unsaid stories in his chest for years. There were small coincidences no one ever forgot. Carter and Funches shared the same first name, wore the same shoe size, and a doctor once remarked that their blood pressure readings were nearly identical. It was as if fate had quietly arranged for one Johnny to step in, just as the other stepped away without knocking the whole group off its path. The Dells pushed forward again, but stability was never meant to last long in their world. In 1966, they were invited to join a national tour with Ray Charles, the idol of almost every singer they knew. On paper, it looked like a breakthrough. In reality, from the first day they were treated like outsiders. Their name was nowhere on the posters. They weren't allowed to rehearse with the main band. No one spoke to them unless necessary. They were given a handful of opening numbers, then quietly shuffled off stage. It all came to a head on a winter night at Carnegie Hall. The Dells performed Stay in My Corner, and something electric happened. The audience stood not once, not twice, but 5 separate times. It was the kind of response most artists only dream about, the kind that imprints itself on the inside of your eyelids so you can replay it in the dark. But before they could celebrate, reality arrived with cold efficiency. The next morning at a bus station on the way to Peoria, the tour manager handed them a scrap of paper. On it were 5 words: "There's no room for the Dells." No apology, no explanation, just a decision. They stood there with their worn luggage breath, turning white in the cold, absorbing the message. No one needed to say out loud what they all understood. The dream had just been doused again, this time without even the courtesy of a conversation. Still, as before, they refused to collapse. The Dells went back into the studio, no big sponsor, no powerful advocate behind them, and re-recorded Stay in My Corner, pouring into it every bruise, every insult, every late-night doubt they had collected over the years. Marvin held a single note for 19 seconds longer than it takes most people to chew a bite of bread. Listeners couldn't believe it. That note carried more than vocal technique. It held pain, defiance, and a stubborn kind of faith that refused to die. More songs followed. There is the love we had, a heart is a house for love. Love songs stripped of glitter, written not for fairy tales, but for people who had already lost something and were still somehow standing. They sang about romance, yes, but also about the things they'd sacrificed, the nights they'd endured, the years they'd spent on stages that never promised a tomorrow. By then, chart positions mattered less. For the Dells, the real victory was simpler. As long as they could keep singing, and people remembered their name, the struggle hadn't been for nothing. So they kept going as if staying under the lights might somehow freeze time. They kept performing as though applause could hold back aging illness and the slow, invisible cracks forming inside them. From the outside, the Dells looked unbreakable. A group that had survived car wrecks, industry rejection, brutal tours, and lineup changes. To fans they seemed almost immortal. But inside they were bleeding slowly, one voice at a time. Not every venue came with bright lights. There were nights so dark and airless that a member slipped quietly out of this world without a single headline. Deaths with no warning, no tribute, no horns playing them out, only the faint echo of a last note fading in an empty room, as if even the music itself was in mourning. Are you ready to hear the rest of this story? Because from this point on, the familiar names you've come to know will begin to vanish from the stage, one after another, as if some invisible curse had finally come to collect its due. Their deaths did not arrive together in some single tragic headline. They came separately, quietly, each one like another note being faded out of a song the world had forgotten it was still listening to. And with every passing member it felt less like coincidence and more like a script that had been written long ago, waiting to be carried out. The first to go was Johnny Funches, the original Johnny the voice that had once led them under the bridge in Harvey. He was also the first to step away from the group, choosing the fragile stability of home and fatherhood over the endless pull of the road. After years of a modest, almost unseen life in suburban Chicago, he died of pneumonia on a bleak winter day in 1998. The wind tore at the streets, snow fell in thick sheets, and inside a small wooden church, in Blue Island, friends and family gathered for his memorial. Then something happened that people still whisper about. When the sound system began to play one of the group's earliest recordings, a song Johnny himself had written, the audio suddenly warped. The track came through thin and distorted, like it was being played from another world. Most people blamed a bad cable, a weak speaker. But an old friend sitting in the back row shook his head and murmured that was his last note. No one argued. 11 years later, the second Johnny followed. Johnny Carter, the replacement so seamless that many listeners never realized the first tenor had changed, spent his final months in a Chicago hospital battling cancer. His body shrank, his voice grew faint, but his mind never fully left the stage. On his last night, too weak to talk in full sentences, he motioned for the nurse to come closer. Straining for breath, he forced out a single question. "Do I still sound in tune?" Before she could answer, his eyes closed, and the room fell into a silence so complete it felt as if the world itself had leaned in to listen. Marvin Jr., the man who had carried those impossibly long notes and the weight of so many choruses, died in 2013. He had spent years wrestling with kidney failure, his body paying the final bill for a lifetime of singing with every ounce of strength he had. According to his son, the record player in his room was spinning "Stay in My Corner" that night, just as it had so many times before. And when the song reached the exact high note Marvin had once held for a full 19 seconds longer than most people can comfortably breathe, the digital display suddenly went dark. In that instant, his own voice on tape kept singing while his real voice fell silent forever. Chuck Barksdale was the last pillar to fall, yet his ending was no less cruel. The solid bass at the foundation of their harmonies, he had always been the one to hold the group steady when everything else shook. After years fighting diabetes, his legs finally gave out. His body refused to move the way it once had across a stage. He spent his final months in a wheelchair, unable to walk out into the lights that had once welcomed him. He rarely sang and spoke even less. Instead, he filled a worn notebook with memories and half-finished lines. After his death in 2019, someone opened that notebook and found a final message, scrawled in a shaky left-handed script on the last page. "We're still harmonizing in each other's sleep." That line was never set to music. It stayed there trapped in ink. The harsh truth is that none of them were given the kind of farewell you might expect for men who had once moved crowds to their feet. There were no televised tributes, no major network retrospectives, no national moments of silence. No grand farewell concerts where the remaining members stood together for one last bow. They left this world the way the final echo of a song slips into the air softly until no one is quite sure when it stopped. The story should have turned around long before that. If there were any justice in the industry, they'd given their lives to the Dells, would have been honored as legends while they were still alive and strong. But recognition took its time. It wasn't until 2004, after 9 separate nominations, that the Dells were finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That night, the surviving members stepped onto the stage carrying a single battered microphone. It was the same one they had once shared under the viaduct at 147th Street as teenagers. As they bowed, one of them quietly said, "We brought the place where it all began." For a moment the crowd went completely silent, because nothing stirs a room like a memory that somehow still breathes after everything else has faded. But that flash of honor lasted only one evening. 2 decades later, in 2024, when someone finally dug through public financial records, looking for the Dells, the number that appeared on the screen was under $200, the total assets tied to one of the longest-running vocal groups in American music. No triumphant reunion tour had been organized. No lavish tribute nights were held in their name. Some surviving members ended up living with grandchildren in small apartments on Chicago's South Side. Others moved into quiet care homes in the suburbs where they volunteered to teach elderly residents how to sing, just to keep their voices working. They almost never spoke about the past. Maybe they didn't want to reopen old wounds. Maybe they were afraid that if they described how big their lives had once been, it would sound like they were making it up. The cruelest part is that their poverty wasn't random. It was engineered. In the early days, their contracts had been signed in cramped, dusty offices, where the air smelled more like old paper than opportunity. Terms were read out quickly, if at all. No lawyer sat beside them. Often they never even received a copy of the agreement they'd just signed. They were told they were lucky just to be given a chance. According to rumors that circulated through industry back channels throughout the 1970s, their label quietly reissued older tracks overseas packaged as collections or heritage series, complete with glossy new artwork. Profits came in, but no royalties reached the men whose voices filled those records. By the time the Dells discovered what had happened, the money was gone, and they were too tired, too worn down to wage a drawn-out legal war they might not live to see decided. In one short interview, Marvin Jr. tried to laugh about it and said, "We were the first group to sign a contract without actually getting a contract." People chuckled. But underneath the joke, you could hear the sting of knowing exactly how much had been taken and how little they could do to reclaim it. By the end, none of the Dells lived in the kind of comfort people assume comes with fame. Some shared cramped spaces with family members, their gold records hanging crooked over cluttered dresses. Others stayed in public nursing homes, where occasional staff or visitors asked them to hum a few lines from the old songs, almost as a party trick. It was a reminder and a question all at once. Were they really who they said they used to be? One nurse later recounted that she only realized one patient had once been a celebrated singer because of what happened every night. Just before he drifted off in that creaking metal bed, he would whisper the same old chorus to himself, barely louder than a breath, as if he was trying to prove, if only to himself, that the music had been real. On a rainy night, in early 2007, a former member walked into the office of a small local newspaper carrying a stack of dusty, unreleased recordings. He didn't ask for a feature story or an advance payment. He simply said, "I want people to know we were here." The young editor listened politely, nodded, and later admitted that, when he closed the door behind the man, he had no idea he'd just turned away a living fragment of music history. No 10th anniversary celebration ever came together. No final performance reunited them all on the same stage. No carefully planned farewell captured their voices one last time. The Dells slipped out of the industry like ghosts, scattered and aging, each man dying in his own quiet corner, carrying with him the memory of nights when arenas shook under the sound of their harmonies. They had once believed that music itself would be their shield, that if they just sang beautifully enough, if they burrowed deep enough into the hearts of their listeners, they would be protected from oblivion. But the truth proved far harsher than any ballad they ever recorded. Their oldest contracts had carved them out of their own future. Their royalties vanished into ledgers they never saw. By the time the accounting caught up with them, there was nothing left to count. All that remained were old vinyl records gathering dust in second-hand stores, streaming numbers no one explained, and the fading memory of somebody somewhere pressing play on Stay in My Corner, late at night and whispering they were something once. So this is how the journey of the Dells ended, not with a roar, but with a soft, almost polite silence. Men who had once made entire theaters rise to their feet with a single held note ultimately fell under the combined weight of illness, poverty, and contracts no one bothered to read with them or for them. And that leaves us with questions no award, no belated honor can fully answer. Did they deserve to vanish into the margins like that? Is it acceptable that a lifetime of devotion of early mornings and late-night drives and voices pushed to their limits wasn't enough to guarantee even a peaceful retirement? If you ever found yourself humming, "Oh, What a Night," without knowing who sang it, or felt a lump in your throat during Stay in My Corner, then their story is already part of your life, even if you never knew their names. Somewhere out there, another group is walking the same path, believing that talent and heart will be enough to protect them. So the next time you hear an old soul record playing low in a store or stumble across the name, the Dells buried in the credits of a movie soundtrack, remember this: behind those smooth harmonies lies a lifetime of cracked contracts, underpaid tours, and endings that came too quietly. Some legends don't die because their music stops. They die because the world forgets to listen. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the